The New Materialism. Social Ecology's blog. In the language of physical science, the change from materialism to organic realism, as the new outlook may be termed, is the displacement of the notion of static stuff by the notion of fluent energy. Such energy has its structure of action and flow, and is inconceivable apart from such structure. Alfred North Whitehead, Process and Reality. To many people, materialism is still under the shadow of Descartes. Many of our ideas about materiality in fact remain indebted to Descartes, who defined matter in the 17th century as corporeal substance constituted of length, breadth, and thickness, as extended, uniform, and inert. This provided the basis for modern ideas of nature as quantifiable and measurable, and hence for Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics. According to this model, material objects are identifiably discrete, they move only upon an encounter with an external force or agent, and they do so according to a linear logic of cause and effect. It seems intuitively congruent with what common sense tells us is the real material world of solid, bounded objects that occupy space and whose movements or behaviors are predictable, controllable, and replicable because they obey fundamental and invariable laws of motion. One might term this the extensive worldview of dead matter. That philosophy has been conditioned and informed by non-philosophical domains is a truism, as Alan Badiou tells us. I am perfectly in agreement with the statement that philosophy depends on certain non-philosophical domains, which I have proposed to call the conditions of philosophy, PM 212 KL. 1 For Badiou there are 4 such conditions or non-philosophical domains: science, art, politics, and love. This essay deals with science in our own era and the indicative aspects of how it is informing philosophical speculations. Alfred North Whitehead was one of the first philosophers of the 20th century to observe the birth of a new approach to physics and cosmology within the work of Albert Einstein, relativity, and Max Born, quantum physics. Along with it came a new sense of what matter is, and this changed everything. The worldview of the Cartesian cogito and Newtonian physics was overturned. After this, even the work of such materialists' visions as Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud put forward within a Newtonian Cartesian framework suddenly came into question, as well as many of the followers of the supposed Kantian Copernican revolution in philosophy. Since that time, new views on mind, thought, and matter have vied for a place in the sun. Some even rejected the old materialism outright, as Paul Davies and John Gribbin in The Matter Myth relate it. Then came our quantum theory, which totally transformed our image of matter. The old assumption that the microscopic world of atoms was simply a scaled-down version of the everyday world had to be abandoned. Newton's deterministic machine was replaced by a shadowy and paradoxical conjunction of waves and particles, governed by the laws of chance, rather than the rigid rules of causality. An extension of the quantum theory goes beyond even this. It paints a picture in which solid matter dissolves away, to be replaced by weird excitations and vibrations of invisible field of energy. Quantum physics undermines materialism because it reveals that matter has far less substance than we might believe. It is in the shadows of the newer revolution in physics, as well as even newer theories such as chaos theory, that a new materialism is arising in our midst. This post-Cartesian Newtonian worldview within this new materialism is insistent on describing active processes of materialization of which embodied humans are an integral part, rather than the monotonous repetitions of dead matter from which human subjects are a part. It is important for us to make this difference clear because a further trait of much of the new materialism is its antipathy toward oppositional ways of thinking. As such, its exponents generally decline to locate themselves explicitly through critiques of ontological dualism such as one finds in Cartesianism. They prefer a creative affirmation of a new ontology, a project that is in turn consistent with the productive, inventive capacities they ascribe to materiality itself. The prevailing ethos of new materialist ontology is consequently more positive and constructive than critical or negative. It sees its task as creating new concepts and images of nature that affirm matter's immanent vitality. Such thinking is accordingly post rather than anti-Cartesian. It avoids dualism or dialectical reconciliation by espousing a monological account of emergent, generative material being. During the 19,705 scientists turned their attention to nonlinear dynamic systems that seem structured yet unpredictable and which mainstream physics had tended to ignore because they are inexplicable in mechanistic terms. As James Gleick remarks of chaos theory, fractals and bifurcations, intermittencies and periodicities are the new elements of motion, just as, in traditional physics, quarks and gluons are the new elements of matter. To some physicists, chaos is a science of process rather than state, of becoming rather than being. While for chaos theory apparently random effects have an extremely complex, nonlinear provenance, for complexity theory the emphasis is on unpredictable events that can catapult systems into novel configurations. For both, the physical world is a mercurial stabilization of dynamic processes. Rather than tending toward inertia or a state of equilibrium, matter is recognized here as exhibiting immanently self-organizing properties subtended by an intricate filigree of relationships. 12 Tumbleweeds, animal species, the planetary ecosystem, global weather patterns, but also new social movements, health and crime, and economics are all amenable to the kind of explanation developed by complexity theorists. Such phenomena are now understood as emergent systems that move with a superficially chaotic randomness that is underlain by patterns of complex organization, which in turn function as foci for further organization and development. Such systems are marked by considerable instability and volatility since their repetition is never perfect. There is a continuous redefining and reassembling of key elements that results in systems' capacities to evolve into new and unexpected forms. Their logic of proliferation is again resonant with new materialist senses of contingent, immanent self-transformation. NM 13-14. Ben Woodard. Ben Woodard in his new book Slime Dynamics offers us one aspect of this new materialism. Woodard tells us that vitalism is traditionally not unlike emergentism in that both suggest there is something more to life, something that drives and/or affects life that is not purely reducible to the classifiable components of life itself, SD 8. Against this signification of vitalism as emergentism as that which harbors the meaning of life or vital substance that propels life forward, he offers instead the theory that the vital force is time and its effect on space that propels all things forward, SD 8. In his readings of Deleuze, Guattari, Bergson and Merleau-Ponty he comes to the realization that vitalism cannot be a thing, that it cannot be a force because it says nothing about life itself as a force, only that it develops but not how. SD 9. What all the philosophers of vitalism have left out is a dark truth Woodard tells us, one that shows forth the force of time itself. Time as something beyond thought which is the force of vitalism, life emerges over time, and the substance of vitalism is not the germplasm trumping heredity but space as it is filled by life, SD 9. 3. He goes on to ask a central question, how do we bring vitalism into contact with reality and raise it from its spatio-temporal philosophical obscurity? SD 10. The articulation of vitalism that he presents is what he terms a minimalist metaphysics which operates on reality by way of following an ontological cascade mirroring the cosmological progression of forces and matters. 10. He takes an almost Spinozaist turn, rooted in the Neoplatonic one, telling us that this force of forces arises out of the original one, a one not as a pure unification but the possibility of isness itself stemming from the original simultaneous explosion of time and space as well as the resulting emanations, immanences, emergences and transcendences. SD 10. He argues that vitalism is a mental shadow of the progression of the universe from the speculative moment before the Big Bang, as a highly condensed mass, to its extension into time and space and matter, to biological life, and finally to reflective thinking. SD 10-11. He sees this as a degenerate take on vitalism and the Neoplatonic one, and together they form his unique theory of dark vitalism. This dark vitalism led Woodard to the sickening realization that the universe is oblivious to human existence, that this inhospitable universe is shaped by the force of time and that all things within it are accidents of the contortions of a universal geometry of space that shapes all things, including us, which are further ravaged by accident, context, feedback, and the degradation of wear and age. St. 11. The universal geometry of this dark vitalism is formed by the threefold darkness of its central unfolding. First, it is dark because it is obscured by both nature and by time. Since the cause of the most of the nature we know has fallen back into the deep past. Second, it is dark because it spells bad news for the human race in terms of our origin, our meaning, and our ultimate fate. And, finally, it is dark on an aesthetic and experiential level. Our psychological and phenomenological existence is darkened and less friendly to us, and to our perceptions, given the destructiveness of time and space. St. 11-12. Jane Bennett. Jane Bennett in her work Vibrant Matter offers another spin on this new materialism. Her work arises within the tradition of Epicurus, Lucretius, Hobbes, Spinoza, Lamarck, Diderot. The marks of his dissertation on Democritus, the elitary materialism of Althusser, Deleuze, and others, within which the distinctions between life and matter, organic and inorganic, human and non-human, men and God, are not necessarily the most important ones to honor. Bennett tells us that she is seeking a new materialism that eschews the life-matter binary and does not believe in God or spiritual forces, nevertheless also acknowledges the presence of an indeterminate vitality, albeit one that resists confinement to a stable hierarchy, in the world. It affirms a cosmos of a lively materiality that is my body and which also operates outside it to sometimes join forces with it and sometimes to vie against it. Ibid. NM 63. Vital materialists will thus try to linger in those moments during which they find themselves fascinated by objects, taking them as clues to the material vitality that they share with them. This sense of a strange and incomplete commonality with the outside may induce vital materialists to treat non-humans, animals, plants, earth, even artifacts and commodities more carefully, more strategically, more ecologically. VM 403 KL, 7. Karen Barad, I've written of her agential realism, here. At the heart of her agential realist project is the questioning of quantum entanglements in terms of the specifics of relational ontology. The fact is that these apparatuses of bodily production are interacting with and mutually constituting one another. That is, what is at issue is the primacy of relations over Ilato and the interactive emergence of cause and effect as enacted by the agential practices that cut things together and apart. Barad, 388-389. We can thus set out an account of quantum entanglement in this way. 1. Quantum entanglement shows that there are non-supervenient relations among physical systems over and above the spatio-temporal relations, strongly non-supervenient relations in contrast to weakly non-supervenient relations. 2. The non-supervenient relations of entanglement among the parts of a quantum whole amount to the whole having intrinsic properties that do not supervene on intrinsic properties of the parts. 3. These properties of the whole come to non-separability in the following sense: the parts have some of the properties that belong to the family of properties which make something a quantum system not separately, but only in this way. There are properties of the whole which indicate the manner in which the parts are related with each other with respect to some of the properties that make something a quantum system. Wiki, Quantum Entanglement. Quentin Mille-Lassou. It would be no exaggeration to say that Quentin Mille-Lassou has opened up a new path in the history of philosophy, hitherto conceived as the history of what it is to know, a path that circumvents Kant's canonical distinction between dogmatism, skepticism and critique. Yes, there is absolute logical necessity. Yes, there is radical contingency. Yes, we can think what there is, and this thinking in no way depends upon a supposedly constituting subject. Alan Badiou from the Preface to After Finitude. Another of the new materialist is the author of After Finitude, for whom the mathematization of nature is central. Certainly, the presence of an observer may eventually affect the effectuation of a physical law, as is the case for some of the laws of quantum physics, but the very fact that an observer can influence the law is itself a property of the law which is not supposed to depend upon the existence of an observer. Once again, the fundamental point at issue is not the fact that science is spontaneously realist, since the same could be said of every discourse, but rather the fact that science deploys a process whereby we are able to know what may be while we are not, and that this process is linked to what sets science apart, the mathematization of nature. F 1671 KL. It was Galileo, as Miles tells it, who first conceived of movement itself in mathematical terms, and particularly the movement which appears to be the most changeable of all, the falling of terrestrial bodies. In doing so, he uncovered, beyond the variations of position and speed, the mathematical invariant of movement, that is to say, acceleration. From that point on, the world becomes exhaustively mathematizable. The mathematizable no longer designates an aspect of the world that is essentially emerged within the non-mathematizable, that is a surface or trajectory, which is merely the surface or trajectory of a moving body. It now indicates a world capable of autonomy, a world wherein bodies as well as their movements can be described independently of their sensible qualities, such as flavor, smell, heat, etc. The world of Cartesian extension is a world that acquires the independence of substance, a world that we can henceforth conceive of as indifferent to everything in it that corresponds to the concrete, organic connection that we forge with it. It is this glacial world that is revealed to the moderns, a world in which there is no longer any up or down, center or periphery, nor anything else that might make of it a world designed for humans. For the first time, the world manifests itself as capable of subsisting without any of those aspects that constitute its concreteness for us. FKL 1678–1685. Miles tells us that philosophy took a wrong turn with Kant. He asks, why did philosophy not take the course exactly opposite to the one followed by transcendental or phenomenological idealism, viz., the course of a thought capable of accounting for the non-correlational scope of mathematics, which is to say, for the very existence of science, the latter being properly understood as the power to decenter thought? Why did philosophy, in attempting to think science, err towards transcendental idealism instead of resolutely orienting itself, as it should have, towards a speculative materialism? How is it that the most urgent question which science poses to philosophy has become, as far as philosophy itself is concerned, the pointless question par excellence, viz. How is thought able to think what there can be when there is no thought? FKL 1768–1772. It is this return to the great outdoors of material reality that is at the center of all these new materialism, each posing different questions and providing different and at time opposing answers, yet, each offering a way out of the predicaments that have stymied philosophy for over 200 years. There are those such as Slavoj Žižek for whom Hegel and a return to dialectical materialism is the path. What, then, is the thing in itself from a dialectical materialist standpoint? The best way to answer this question is, again, to oppose dialectical materialism to Buddhism. In Buddhism, the in itself is the void, nothing, and ordinary reality is a play of appearances. The question ultimately unanswered here is how we get from nothing to something. How do illusory appearances arise out of the void? The dialectical materialist answer is, only if this something is less than nothing, the pre-ontological proto-reality of Den. From within this proto-reality, our ordinary reality appears through the emergence of a subject which constitutes objective reality. Every positive reality of one's is already phenomenal, transcendentally constituted, correlated to a subject. In Badiou's terms, every reality is that of a world defined by its transcendental coordinates, LTN 21362-21368 KL. 5. Like a religious prophet, an Arabi crying in the wilderness of the wastelands of late capitalist culture and society, he bursts through our sleeping ideologies, breaking the vessels of our darkening minds against the truth of our lived lives. Why not a rather depersonalized mystical experience in which I step out of myself and identify with the other's gaze? Likewise, if truth has to be lived, Why need this involve a struggle? Why not rather a meditative inner experience? The reason is that the spontaneous state of our daily lives is a lived lie, to break out of which requires a continuous struggle. 12. We must once again become terrified ourselves. To gain courage against the terror of the global order, we must be shown the terror and shame within ourselves, and to do this one must not be afraid to learn from one's enemies. We must begin to study, not our own liberal progressives, and not the reactionary populists, but the ideologues of critical conservatism, if we are ever to understand that strange beast, the truth of capitalism in our world today as the institutionalization of envy. 13. The truth today must be one that is testable, one that is gauged against its truth effect, its ability to unleash the forces within the multitude, thereby transforming them into revolutionary subjects. 13. He tells us there is a paradox: one must not only see it to believe it, but one must believe it to see it. Believing it to see it is a truth event, as opposed to knowledge, and is, like a Bedouin event, something that only an engaged gaze, the gaze of a subject who believes in it, is able to see. 14. He sees himself caught in a vice between two opposing camps, the extreme left, who see him as a covert Slovene nationalist and an unpatriotic traitor of my nation, and the extreme right, who see him as anti-Semitic and for spreading Zionist lies. Yet, from this he realizes, as Sartre did during We I, that he is on the right path, the path of fidelity to freedom. 14. Like a newborn Spartacus of the people, he strides tall against the worldly powers of global capitalism, and alluding to St. Paul's relevant New Testament speech on our struggle against the powers that be, Isaac translates it into our darker times language. Our struggle is not against actual corrupt individuals, but against those in power in general, against their authority, against the global order and the ideological mystification which sustains it. 15. To do this, to engage these global powers of authority and order, we must enter that stage of struggle as defined by Alan Badiou as Myux Vort und Desaster und etc. Or, as Zizek says, better to take the risk and engage in fidelity to a truth event, even if it ends in catastrophe, than to vegetate in the eventless utilitarian hedonist survival of what Nietzsche called the last men. 15. Against the liberal ideology of victimhood, and its corollary reduction of politics to avoiding the worst, and following a bland politics of the least bad option, we should accept the struggle, rise up and regain our fidelity to freedom. 8. Ray Brassier. In the old worldview he sees a naturalist perspective in which God is the ultimate source and guarantor of this meaningful order, one in which humans are the central players in a cosmic drama within which they struggle from Genesis to Apocalypse between an ethical agony of good and evil forces. Against this backdrop is the emergence of natural science and mathematics during the 16th century. One might call this the age of unraveling, when the monotheistic worldview began to come apart at the seams, each thread unraveling until we reach the age of nihilism, in which life is seen as without purpose and meaning. Yet, for Brassier, this is freedom from the long dominion of a false system, and the opening toward a new worldview in which intelligibility has become detached from meaning, thereby providing us with the postulate that knowledge no longer needs the support of a posited God to support meaning. Brassier sees this as a decisive step forward in the slow process through which human rationality has gradually abandoned mythology, which is basically the interpretation of reality in narrative terms. In this next stage, a naturalist narrative takes over as the engine and driver of ontologies, with science and philosophy as supporting methods that interact and formulate the underlying threads of this strange realism that is shaping us. Instead of an existential view that still supported humanity as the central player in this ongoing creation of meaning, the newest perspective sees humanity as just one more object for the mill of science to work on. The newest project explains humanity and consciousness in particular not as meaning creation system, but as part of products of purposeless but perfectly intelligible processes, which are at once neurobiological and socio-historical. Yet, even our aspiration for an ontological perspective that would encompass this new naturalist worldview is but an epistemically derivative useful fiction. He tells us that the elimination of metaphysical explanations and the implication of a narrative of cognitive progress can be backed up by the philosopher Robert Brandam's reconstructive reading of Hegel, which he states frees the normative ideal of explanatory progress from its metaphysical, and ultimately mythological, inflation into the universal history of spirit. Against the nihilism Nietzsche's as if fictions that are life-enhancing, Brassier considers himself of another type in that he refuses this Nietzschean solution and continue to believe in the difference between truth and falsity, reality and appearance. In other words, I am a nihilist precisely because I still believe in truth, unlike those whose triumph over nihilism is won at the cost of sacrificing truth. I think that it is possible to understand the meaninglessness of existence, and that this capacity to understand meaning as a regional or bounded phenomenon marks a fundamental progress in cognition. Brassier continues telling us that this new transcendental materialist critique is no longer a Hegelian or dialectical sublation of this difference. It's non-dialectical. It's a reduction of the difference to matter, because Land claims thinking is a function of materiality, and representational thought, that is to say, conceptual categorization, and even, on this account, the logic of the dialectic itself, is simply a circumscribed or depotentiated version of a functional potency generated by matter itself. The claim is that matter itself is synthetic and productive. Matter is primary process, and everything that unfolds at the level of conceptual representation is merely secondary and derivative. Synthesis is primary and productive, and all synthesis is the conjoining of heterogeneous terms. He will retain the Kantian primacy of transcendental synthesis, yet not in empirical terms, that is, of objects of experience anchored in a constituting subject. The key term becomes self-synthesizing potency of intensive materiality. As he states it, matter is nothing but machinic production, self-differentiation. And the fundamental binary that organizes this materialist metaphysics is that between intensive materiality, which he identifies with the body without organs, and death, this moment of absolute indifference as absolute difference. Land is quite explicit about the link to a certain version of Solinianism here. He explicitly links Deleuze and Guattari to Schelling. Brassier tells us that this very subversion of the Bergsonian element of vitalism within Deleuze's thought, and its related materialist subversion of Kantianism brings with it a new set of problems. 6. That there is no unified view or school of new materialism is part of our current dilemma and a vibrant aspect of its justification. Instead of some strong philosophical progenitor, we have the multitude of philosophical projects that are shaping and revisioning the heritage of philosophical practice within a new scientific worldview. That, as Badiou emphasizes, science may be a condition for philosophy, it is not its dictator, so as we see the new materialist's vision is an open groundless ground of mutual assaying of the present tendencies within philosophy rather than some monolithic tomb of extinct ideas. What this presents us with is a distinctly monistic vision in which everything is about emergent processes. An materialist object in this view is never a finished product, it always becomes involved in new assemblages and contexts without bound, mutating, becoming, transforming, blooming into a thousand-fold lotus of materiality. As Kuhl and Frost emphasize, the new materialists are rediscovering a materiality that materializes, evincing immanent modes of self-transformation that compel us to think of causation in a multitude of interlocking systems and forces and to consider anew the location and nature of capacities for agency, NM 9. Instead of matter existing within some immersive substrate or opaque plenitude and or continuum, these new materialists see matter as indeterminate, constantly forming and reforming in unexpected ways, NM 10. Matter becomes rather than is. Objects form and self-organize within a matrix or field of compositional and multi-relational forces or events, Whitehead, composing their natural environments in ways that are corporeally meaningful for them, and subjectivities being constituted as open series of capacities or potencies that emerge hazardously and ambiguously within a multitude of organic and social processes, NM 10. They tells us this new materialism is a monolithic and multiply-tiered ontology with no definitive boundary separating sentient from non-sentient entities or material from spiritual phenomena. NM10. Because of the new philosophy of dynamism and materiality, they see both an ethical and political turn within this philosophical perspective of both the new materialist philosophies and sciences, bioethics and biopolitics. For this new materialism, as well as the life sciences and physics, material phenomena are seen and conceptualized not as discrete entities or closed systems but rather as open, complex systems with porous boundaries. NM15. Moving out of the age of what Giorgio Agamben called the anthropological machine of humanism, these new materialists conceptualize the capacities of matter for agency. As a result, they tell us the human species, and the qualities of self-reflection, self-awareness, and rationality traditionally used to distinguish it from the rest of nature, may now seem little more than contingent and provisional forms or processes within a broader evolutionary cosmic productivity. TNM 20. The politics of science and ethics within this post-humanist and materialist problematic tells us that as scientists succeed in bridging species, artificially creating and extending human and animal life, and manipulating and synthesizing genes to create new life forms, they muddle the concepts and boundaries that are the ground for much ethical and political thinking. NM 22. If scientists do succeed in inventing new life forms and intelligent agents, what kind of ethical value should we attribute to these new forms and according to what criteria? They tells us that any new ethical, political, and philosophical materialism should be both methodologically and epistemologically oriented toward a new realist sociological analysis, and also continue to focus on the material, political and economic aspects of society and power. NM 26. They say these new materialist philosophers will become more open and egalitarian in their materialist analysis, bringing biopolitics, critical geopolitics, and political economy together with genealogies and phenomenologies of everyday life. N. 28. Whether you agree with them or not, and I do have questions that I will need more time to develop, one must confront their thinking and understand the implications of their diagnosis, otherwise one becomes complicit with the forces that would enslave us all within an imaginary of that dystopian nightmare world that is nothing more than the death drive made imminent and irrecusable. Other new materialists such as Rosie Braidotti and Manuel de Landa deserve mention, and I will take up their work in future posts.